Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to the fifth installment of our Geoethics Aotearoa seminar series. Um, I'm here with, virtually with AJ and Jenny from Geoethics Aotearoa. This seminar series, if you haven't been to any before, is a student-run group that is aiming to bring discussions diverse interdisciplinary perspectives into geoscience spaces. Um, so I should let you know, first of all, that the session is being recorded and it'll go up on the GSNZ Geoethics YouTube channel. AJ might be able to post a link to that in the chat if you want to watch previous seminars. But if you don't want your face to be potentially on YouTube, you just switch your camera off. Um, so we've got two amazing speakers today, and we've got a decent amount of time set aside for discussion afterwards. So feel free to put any questions or thoughts in the chat, and we will make sure that we take note of them and that they get asked at the end. But also feel free to just put your hand up or chime in the discussion session at the end, because yeah, we want to be really collective and fruitful discussion. Yeah, the Jenny's just put the YouTube playlist in the chat if anyone is interested. We've had some really good talks so far. So I'm going to start us off with a karakia. For anyone that's coming from outside of New Zealand, this is just a way to bring us in to the space of the discussion and kind of set our intentions. And I really like this karakia because the purpose of this seminar series is to have really productive and enlightening discussions with kind of respect and no hierarchy within them. So if you join me, e arara, e arara. E arara e te kōrero, e arara e te wānanga, e arara e te whakaaro nui, e arara e te ngākau whakaiti, tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, tīna, haumie, huie, tāiki. Thank you. So, our first speaker today is Glenn Banks, and I'm going to give him a chance to share his screen while I introduce him. So Glenn is a professor of geography at Massey University, and he's worked within and around the mining industry in the Pacific for more than 30 years, both in academic and a consulting capacity. So a lot of theoretical work as well as engaging across a wide variety of mining contexts in the Pacific. And today he's going to talk to us about a convivial extraction, asking the question, can we live well with mining? So take it away, Glenn.
Kia ora, and thank you, Frank. And thank you everyone for coming along, and thank you for the opportunity to speak as part of this series. The screen's shared correctly. I'm all good to go. Excellent. Right. Let's see if I can make things go forward from here. Yeah, as Frank said, these days I'm very interested in this question of, is it possible to live well with extraction? And that's coming out of a particular theoretical strand that's developed in a completely different sector in the world of conservation, this notion of convivial conservation. So I'll get to that in a second. Just a little bit about me. As Frank indicated, I've spent way too long. I can talk to people about. I've been working on this since last century now, and it kind of means something. Started off as a student. I did my master's in geography down at Canterbury, and then my PhD at ANU, working on mining in Papua New Guinea, mostly local stuff. And in more recently, I've branched into the last decade or so working on issues around policy, mineral policy, and national, regional mineral policy as well. So some work in Fiji and Solomon Islands as well. I've worked as a student, a researcher, and as consultant, and I can see a a friend of the environmental movement that I was speaking to this morning. Catherine, nice to see you again. I'll cover very quickly three things today. I couldn't decide which of them to spend more time on, so I thought I'd just introduce them very briefly, and we can come back to conversation about any of these as people might see fit. First is around some of the ideas, the concepts that are coming out of political ecology, and three terms in particular that I'll speak to. And then a little bit on some of the recent work I've been doing about looking very closely at the way in which the industry sells itself in terms of the economic contribution it makes, and then finish up talking a little bit about critical minerals and the way in which critical minerals are defined, and pose a question really to those of you in the geosciences field about the geoethics of critical minerals. To start with then, in terms of political ecology, there's three terms I really want to flag at this stage, and we're very happy to come back and talk about these. The first of these is the notion of conviviality, and this comes out of work on conservation that Bram Buscher and Rob Fletcher have been leading for the last decade or so. And they're very interested in finding ways of living with conservation. And I think there's an interesting discussion we can be having about transferring that question about conservation to the world of extraction. Is it possible to live well with extraction? And if so, how do we get there? Because it's pretty clear right now that there's a lot of issues tied up with mining and extraction in different forms, a whole bunch of social issues, cultural issues, economic issues, and figuring a way around that, a pathway through that, I think needs a different approach. And political ecology and particularly conviviality offer potential pathways to that. And essentially what Bram and Rob are suggesting in terms of conservation is thinking about where we want to be in the future. And you don't need to necessarily buy into the whole argument, but this idea of a post-capitalist possibility concerned with extraction. And they say there's two things we need to do to start advancing down this pathway of a different way of living with extraction. The first is to discursively talk through, have better conversations, different ways of imagining futures, capitalist, post-capitalist futures, different narratives, and a better quality of conversation around the extractive sector. And this is not just pointed, and the industry people will probably be nodding their heads and saying, yes, we need a better quality of conversation around mining. It's also very much a conversation directed at the sector and saying a different way of talking about mining and a different range of possibilities, different ways of imagining the way in which mining can proceed beyond the standard model is really important. And being open to those conversations in a way that's not necessarily as conservative as a lot of the discourse around the sector currently seems to be. So there's a strong discursive element, a way of talking about and reimagining different forms of futures for living with extraction. But there's also a strong materiality aspect to it. And this comes through very strongly in Bram and Rob's work. They say there's a lot of stuff already happening out there, a lot of good stuff that offers different aspects. It's not the complete picture. And a lot of it tends to be smaller scale or particular niche projects that are appearing here and there. And building on those, experimenting, finding different ways of doing things, changing practices, reaching back to different ways of doing and understanding the way in which mining works, adopting, innovating, all of these different aspects hold potential to a different way of living with extraction. And not all of them will work. I mean, there's the idea that we can try different things and some of them will fall over is absolutely part of this potential pathway forward. And on that materiality, I fall back on fairly frequently a paper that I was involved in working on that came out in Extractive Industries and Society a couple of years ago with Thomas Fredrickson from Manchester University. And in that, we did really a bit of a thought experiment about what would a mining sector committed to sustainable development actually look like in the 21st century. And we proposed a series of eight, I think there were eight behaviours that we said a mining sector that was committed to being a responsible contributor to sustainable forms of development would need to look at. And these include things like cleaner production, accepting limits to where they go, and that can be in the physical sense, but it can also be in the social sense and the conservation sense. Embracing recycling, reduction, a large element of accepting responsibility for their own actions. So admitting fault and trade-offs, policing itself as a sector, embracing transparency and systematic monitoring, accepting and respecting external regulation, and paying its way. And I'll come back to the money aspect in a second. But I won't dwell on any of those right now because potentially you can go away and check up on the paper, and I'd be happy to have more discussion about any of those. Just one other point to make about that is that we weren't making this stuff up. What we were identifying was a bunch of practices that certain companies in certain places, certain operations were actually already doing. So there's evidence out there that the sector can do things differently in different places, different mindsets of different managers, different resources that are applied to it, different ways of regulating itself, transparency. There's a big global extractive industries transparency initiative. It's out there. It shows, it demonstrates that the industry can operate in different kinds of ways. And I think that's really important to build on what's already happening out there. So conviviality was the first of the terms. The second is this notion of just transitions. And this is a term that many of you will no doubt be aware of. It's increasingly being used within the sector and within government, this idea that the green energy transition has all sorts of benefits attached to it, but it also has the potential to inflict new environmental and social harms on communities. And the idea of a just transition is finding ways to mitigate these harms, to make sure that just advancing the interests of, to take one example, countries in the West in terms of renewable energy doesn't damage environments and societies in other parts of the world, such as the Pacific. So it's about ensuring communities and employees are not adversely affected by new and expanded mining sectors, as well as managing the closure of existing coal mines, for example. So not throwing those communities under a bus as well. Just a couple of quotes there that came up. One of them is actually from MB, a report they did on just transitions, and they note that justice is about relationships, and that it's about relationships that we can justify to each other. So there's a quality of relationships that needs to be taken into account here. And then it finishes up with an inspiring quote, which I came back to as part of this work, and I thought, oh, got to slip that in there somewhere too. Relationships and relationality are critical to different ways of imagining the way in which extraction can happen in the future. So ask some questions about what if communities had more control over decisions about subsurface resources. And again, we can point to examples where this has happened. How can we think about more skillfully and sensitively engaging with radical ideas now already on the table? How can we have those better forms of conversations? And what if resources themselves had a voice in these conversations? And you sort of think, oh, well, that's nice and abstract. No, it's not. We're doing it. It's happening here in New Zealand now. And Shane Jones he was gobsmacked by the idea that he might actually have to have a conversation with the Moana about the iron sands on the seabed of Taranaki. So giving legal personhood to a mountain means that that mountain should be involved in talking about the extraction of a resource which is directly derived from that particular mountain. Okay, moving on to the second thing very quickly, chasing the money. We hear these sorts of statements all the time, and this is just one example. It's actually, I think it's all from one particular proposal right now. $1 billion in CapEx, $268 million operational spend in New Zealand every year, hundreds of jobs created, hundreds of millions in taxes and royalties annually. Where do I start? I mean, that the CapEx and foreign direct investment, yes, they're spending $1 billion, but let's look at how much they're actually extracting in terms of dividends. And there's one proposal that we're talking about today where the flow of money offshore from $1 billion investment is at least 2.5 times that. My estimate would be it would be 4 times what they're putting into the country. So let's have a sensible discussion about this. Operational spend versus GDP contribution. They talk about a domestic operational spend that is hundreds of millions, a couple of $100 million a year. A significant proportion of that, possibly 30 or $40 million, might be the diesel that they buy from New Zealand oil companies, which the bulk of the value of that is directly from offshore. So let's have a sensible conversation about some of these things. And how significant is that? The dairy industry, the variation in payments made by the dairy industry between 2023 and 2024 was $200 million in Taranaki alone. Sorry, it was $400 million in Taranaki alone, which was more than twice the total operational spend of this one operation. How significant is it then in the regional and national economies? Jobs, yeah, but even the social impact assessment for this one particular mine was talking about the fact that they don't have the skill capacity in parts of South Taranaki to fill these positions. So the jobs are not going to be, the social impact assessment was very clear. It said it's not going to solve unemployment in this community. And you find the same sorts of things happening in Waihi, the same sorts of things happening in Central Otago. Taxes and royalties, that's a real bugbear for me. One thing that happened in Papua New Guinea between 2014 and 2017, a 4-year period, when exports from PNG of mining and mining alone of well over 4 billion New Zealand dollars, the return to government over that period was virtually zero for 4 years in a row. So the taxation was down because of big spend by the 6 major companies in Papua New Guinea on new operational plant, on depreciation costs, on other operating costs, on a whole raft of things, which meant they paid no tax because of these additional expenses that they had over this period. And there's a myth that at some point down the line, those tax offsets will be recouped further down the line. But there's no evidence that that actually happens. So let's get around this idea that taxes and royalties are a nice, stable source of income for the government from this sector. They're not. And here's this is out of South Taranaki. I had a look at that. And even if you assume that the economic impact assessment is actually accurate, and it's not by a long shot for all the reasons I've just talked about, over 50% of the value of the mineral resource of the iron, the resource that belongs as part of the mountain, belongs to the country as a whole. 50% of that goes offshore in the first cut. And there's a lot of other expenses of the value, which is not going to end up residing in New Zealand. So I'm arguing for a full assessment of costs and benefits, a transparent process, and an acknowledgement of the trade-offs that are being made and accounted for. Think beyond the economic when it comes to these things. Ensure a set proportion of the resource value resides within the country, within the nation. It's a non-renewable resource. We get one crack at this extraction. If we end up with most of it offshore, where's the real return to the country from this? And think about the money there. At the end of the day, we'll make some money off that, try and extract as much value as possible. And remember, it's a non-renewable resource, so stick a large amount of it, or a significant amount of it anyway, into a long-term sovereign wealth fund so that there's intergenerational transfer of the value of that resource. And I'm rocking through here and I'm just about at the end. One thing that has bugged me, things bug me occasionally. I'm getting old and cranky, old white cranky man. One thing that bugged me recently was critical minerals, the way in which the government here in New Zealand flagged the need for a list of critical minerals, and we needed to be making sure that we were doing our bit in terms of the global critical minerals sector. They then blew it any degree of credibility completely out of the water by adding coal and gold to the list of critical minerals. I mean, that just makes a farce of the whole process. So let's not even bother really talking about that. Then there's this fallacy that, oh, we need to make sure that we mine these critical minerals as well so that we are doing our bit. That's not a decision that a nation state makes. That's a decision that's made by a sector which is highly volatile, which pulls money in and out of different countries rapidly based on short-term decision-making processes. We have very little control over that. You've got to recognize that this is a global industry worth, I think, trade in critical minerals last year was about $800 billion. So, New Zealand's tiny little share of that is meaningless in the global context. Then I think there's some questions. I just want to finish with questions really for participants here around the geoethics of this critical mineral production, given that a significant proportion of it is actually being consumed by, I'm not blaming you, Noel, for this at all, but by the US Defense Department. And it's not just the US, but it's China and it's Russia and it's the defense industry globally. How can we justify making a push for we must do our bit for critical minerals when we know that a significant proportion of those critical minerals end up fueling the war machine globally? And to me, that's maybe I'm just a bleeding heart, but to me, that's not a good rationale for getting involved in mining critical minerals. And so there's the last slide. Jeff Bertram, a lovely economist from now retired from Victoria University. I might still have an office down your way, Frank. He 12, 13 years ago said mining will not increase economic welfare. On the contrary, it will often reduce it if done in the wrong place or in the wrong way or without a proper legal and regulatory framework. Mining therefore presents industry-specific problems for regulators and policymakers, which cannot be finessed over by overgeneralized rhetoric or glamorous photography, such as the picture in the background here. So my basic argument then is we need a better convivial conversation about the costs, the benefits, the options, the alternatives, and ways forward for how we can live well with extraction. And I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I feel like you've touched on a bunch of things that have just like cracked open little things that we can get into in the discussion. I certainly have some things that I'd love to hear you talk more about. But in the meantime, we're going to move on to our next speaker. And I think Glenn, having given us quite a nation-specific overview of some aspects of the mining sector, it's going to be really cool to hear from our next speaker, who is coming from a very different location. So I'm very excited to introduce Noel Vineyard, partly because he's our first international speaker in this series, but also because the circumstances of meeting Noel were completely random. I was in the US last year and staying in a backpackers hostel and just got chatting to someone who was staying, I think, just overnight on a big car drive across the country. And yeah, he told me about his PhD, and I was like, that sounds way more interesting than my PhD. And then when we were talking about starting this series, he just popped into my mind. So yeah, Noel is a PhD candidate, very close to submitting. in geography at the University of Nevada, Reno, in the US, and his work focuses on the changing human relationship to water and place resulting from new lithium mining projects being developed in the McDermott Caldera region in Nevada and Oregon. Trained as a human environment geographer, his work draws thinking from science and technology studies, humanistic geographies, political ecology, and legal studies to wrestle with the hydrosocial, ecological, and environmental justice challenges posed by the planetary transition away from fossil fuels. So I'm really excited to hear about this and also to have a discussion of both of these wonderful people's work. So take it away, Noel.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I was hoping you were going to tell that story. It's been, I got to tell my mom that story for the first time earlier today. She thought it was pretty cool too. So I'm really, really grateful you reached out and I'm really excited to be here. So, Glenn, you set up this conversation really, really well because I'm going to jump into a very specific case out of my dissertation work, where I'm really trying to wrestle with what I'm calling these green extraction paradoxes in this part of Nevada that lots of us who spend time out there call the Sagebrush Sea. So this photo on the screen here is one that I took out on the sagebrush steppe landscape in the McDermott Caldera region out in northern central Nevada about a year ago. The region sits on the Oregon-Nevada border. And while this looks like a really beautiful landscape, as you can see out towards the horizon, that is soon to be the United States' first open pit lithium mine. Its proposal is that they're gonna mine it for 100 years, is what they're saying. This sagebrush sea, this is a landscape that's very near and dear to me. It's about 3 hours from where I work now and 3 hours from where I grew up. I actually came back to my hometown to do my PhD on this specific problem because I heard that this stuff was going on. In 2021, I was seeing lots of news coverage of protests and all sorts of political activity, court cases, and public debate sort of on two tracks. It was the parallel need for the United States and the world to mine lithium, to make electric cars, and to get the supply chain away from China. And with that in one hand, the other thing that I was here, the thing in the back of my head is that, it's like I'm do all of this to save the planet, but like this is also part of the planet. And there were lots of concerns in the academic circles I was in about what this was going to do specifically to the region's really fragile water systems and the life systems that depend on those fragile water systems. So I was really perplexed by that paradox that we need to save the planet. We need to do this mining to save the planet, but we're going to destroy this place in particular. So this work that we're doing ostensibly to protect the environment was going to come at the expense of a place that's really dear to me, really dear to a lot of people, and really sacred and important to the indigenous people of Nevada. And I'll get into in a little bit. So I came back and I did my PhD because it seemed like they were getting ready to sacrifice Northern Nevada on the altar of the electric car. And that seemed strange. So the guiding questions for my PhD that came out of this interest were, it's like, how does a place like the McDermott Caldera become imagined and reshaped by this planetary lithium moment? And then how do actors in this space leverage their different hydrosocial imaginaries in the production of the McDermott Caldera as a place, being more than just its location, also containing all of its social meaning? And then from there, how are those hydrosocial imaginaries used in situated experiences of environmental justice to this place? But for the talk today, really, I'm going to be talking through this second question. And I was really reading through on sort of what geoethics is and how it works. My question to all of you to think about as I'm going through this is, what is the geo to which we are being ethical? Who gets to decide what that geo is? And then how are the specific ethics constituted in those places? So just a quick intro on lithium and water. Lithium, water, in place. Lithium in the United States, it was listed as a critical mineral. In the first big list that got pushed really hard was in 2022, but it had been a mineral of interest to the federal government for about 30 years. But specifically with the advent of electric cars, things are really picking up. Sort of a lot of my colleagues and myself, they've we've been trying to bring together and develop a literature that's really looking at the adverse social and ecological impacts of lithium extraction in the places that it's happening, because it's still mining. It's one of the single most, a paper of my colleague Dustin Mulvaney, we documented that in some ways, it's the single most environmentally deleterious activity that human beings do on planet Earth, as far as total landscape disruption. But a lot of the debates around the potential pitfalls and perils of lithium extraction were really focused on the water use, the water impact, and the water displacement from mining. Specifically in the cases of the open pit lithium mines, there have been lots of work done by some of my colleagues on the ways that it's disrupting groundwater availability as we're having to dewater mine pits, changing how people's well systems work, lots of risks of ground and surface water contamination from different leach processes, especially the untested technology they're using in my dissertation case, and then lots of destruction of habitat, and then destruction of sacred landscapes, like we're dealing with in the Great Basin. This picture here on the left, this is actually of the world's current largest open pit lithium mine at Greenbushes in Western Australia. Yeah, fun stuff. So, as I'm coming from rather far away, I thought a map would be really helpful. So the McDermott Caldera region, as you can see down in this inset, it's a post-volcanic valley that sits on the border between Humboldt County, Nevada, and Malheur County, Oregon, to the north. They're like down in here. There's like Reno's down here. Reno, San Francisco, all of that. We're in this little red box here. It's a cold steppe desert landscape, so it gets a little bit more moisture than an actual desert, but not a lot. It supports really large populations of endangered Great Basin sage grouse. There are a lot of endangered fish that live in the fresh surface water systems. Pronghorn deer, and then there are a couple like critically endangered species of like tiny freshwater snails that live in the ephemeral spring systems throughout the region. This actually was the original location, the first documented location we have of the Yellowstone hotspot. As a volcanic region, and that's why all the minerals are so close to the surface. It's close to a couple small ranching communities, Orvada and Kings River to the south, the settler community of McDermott right on the Oregon-Nevada border, and the Fort McDermott Indian Reservation, which is a combined Paiute Shoshone Indian reservation. Mining is, this place has a long history of mining. Historically, it was mercury and uranium that they've mined here. There were cinnabar strikes close to the surface as early as 1917. Unfortunately, that's also meant that there's been a lot of mining contamination and pollution in this area. We've had lots in the town of McDermott and on the reservation. Cinnabar tailings from the original McDermott Cordero mercury mine were actually used as building fill for the roads and the schools. So it was only in 2011 that the EPA started trying to clean it up out there. Most of the high school football field in McDermott is still built on cinnabar tailings. And anecdotally, one woman I've worked with on this project who lives at the Fort McDermott Reservation doesn't know an elder that's died in the last 20 years that hasn't died of cancer. So the Caldera region is this area in red. All of the polygons you see in here are active lithium claims. There's another uranium claim that's up in here too that's not on the map. And then down here, can you guys see my mouse cursor? Yeah. So down here, this polygon is the Thacker Pass mine, which is the first one that's actually under construction in the area. It was that landscape I showed you in the first photo. And this border is actually just for phases 1 and 2 of the mine. After the first 40 years, they plan on expanding it all the way down here past the Caldera edge. The other sort of important piece of this landscape is that this area is super sacred to the Northern Nevada Paiute peoples, the Numu peoples, who live in this region. And the area around Thacker Pass is, in their faith tradition, one of the most sacred sites in their cosmology. in the was it in the mid 19th century. It was the site of two rather large massacres, mostly of women and children. First one by Nevada First Cavalry because women and children were out there praying, and we sent the army in. The second one was by a competing tribe. Yeah, and the site that's really sacred to them is there, right in the middle of the mine site. So it's a burial ground. It was a sacred site before it was a burial ground. It continues to be a sacred site. And the mine is poses all sorts of risks to the area's waters and landscape. I'm not going to get into all the stuff going on with the community of Winnemucca to the south because I want us to have time for a good discussion, and I'm cognizant of our time. So in a lot of my research, one of the things that I'm trying to think about is not just how resources are used, but actually how does the category of resource become constructed? Sort of how do we actually make something a resource? So my work, it draws together research on the hydrosocial cycle. It's an idea that comes out of Jamie Linton's work on what is water and their paper Linton and Buds in 2014 on the hydrosocial cycle, which understands human society and water is mutually co-constituted. Liquid H2O doesn't know that we actually call it water. Through human social relationships with liquid H2O, and through technology, infrastructure, governance, power, we sort of imbue H2O with the meanings that we then use as the social category of water, this liquid that we relate to. So, and that construction of that social content, that hydrosocial imaginary, is the crux of a lot of the work I'm doing and is my into this project. When I say hydrosocial imaginary, I'm describing the sets of values, experiences, and practices that groups of actors use in their production and in their relationship to water as this socially constructed hybrid object. So even calling water a resource in and of itself is a kind of hydrosocial imaginary. So I'm actually going to get into some of my data and some of my findings from one of my chapters just to try and highlight how some of this is working in this place and to really show the different heterogeneity that goes into the different ways that people are producing this category of water as a resource or non-resource. Through the interview portion of my dissertation with stakeholders and actor groups, sort of activated by and affiliated with the lithium production in the McDermott caldera, I identified 3 core hydrosocial imaginaries that actors were leveraging against each other. In their discussions, there was a modern water hydrosocial imaginary, which was very much water as a sort of a resource largely for humans. It was fungible source to source. Water in my canteen was the same as water in the ground. It's just we're just measuring H2O. There was a particular or precarious waters hydrosocial imaginary where actors were very keen to, while keeping it still as a resource, it was a resource for humans and non-humans to use. And it had, its value was in sort of maintaining that landscape scale homeostasis of humans, non-humans, maintaining the ecosystem. But it understood that ecosystem to be really fragile, and that water was very particular to that place. Water in one river was not the same as water in the other river. You couldn't swap them. They needed to be where they were. And then we have the sacred waters hydrosocial imaginary, which understands, which values water for its intrinsic properties. It's treating water as a commodity is malpractice, is antithetical to what that water is and means to those people. And it's interwoven. The water, the people, and the place are all interwoven together. The water isn't a resource, it's a neighbor. It's a friend, it's in all of us. So, in this one place, we have just in the case activated, these actors activated by this lithium project, we have people constructing this category of water as a resource in 3 different ways. So from that, what we get is a lot of interesting discussion on what that water means and what it means for the future and how people are leveraging these imaginaries in doing their future politics. I'm going to go through these really quickly, but the 3 ways that we're seeing this really play out are the ways that These imaginaries inform how people are politicking over the creation of urgency, really trying to haggle on which side of that paradox I talked about at the beginning. It's we have to mine the lithium to save the planet, or mining the lithium is going to destroy this place. Or in the case of the sacred waters hydrosocial imaginary, it's mining this lithium and disrupting this water is, it's an affront, it's a crime to sort of the nature of the place. So it really runs the gambit. Really gets at this idea of time and thinking about the future. Sort of most practically for this group, and the point that I want to get to in just a minute is the kinds of epistemological mistrust that emerges in this place with these competing hydrosocial imaginaries, specifically with the non-positivist, non-measuring approaches to dealing with water and impacts to water from lithium mining being treated by many as childish. So we see this is a quote from an industry professional. Sort of some of the protests and some of the negative press that the mines have gotten. This person said, now at the same time, it takes an adult conversation because words, because words like that can be twisted when talking about mining industry, water, sort of the environmental impact assessment. It says it means I take some understanding and some maturity on both sides of the argument, implying that those that aren't coming to it from that very positivist perspective are doing so from a place that is immature, childish, and naive. And then we have, and even some groups that are willing to concede that yes, we have to play by positivist science rules to get to the regulatory table, realizing that they don't even have the means to hire a hydrologist to come do their water assessment. So even if they wanted to play the game that the government and the companies are wanting to play, they don't even have the means to recoup those resources, to sort of generate those resources, because the only hydraulic studies that exist are the ones produced by the mining companies. That's how the state of Nevada gets almost all of its groundwater data. It's self-reported from mining companies. And for the justice piece of this, and this is something I'm working towards in my third chapter, is this idea that a lot of these discussions about the water also redound to conversations about post-mine, who gets to belong to the future of this place. One person speaking from a very indigenous perspective to the area says that a disruption of the waters in this place is, if it goes on for as long as the mine says it's going to go on, it's severing that spiritual connection they have to that place for so long. 100 years, they will no longer know who they are. The disruption of the waters will be akin to a kind of spiritual genocide. So, thinking about geoethics, the thing that I'm really wrestling with, and I'm coming to really wrestle with in this work, is what do you do in a situation like this when you're encountering sort of a plurality of geos and a plurality of ethics? And sort of, if I, at my core, especially working from an actor network theory perspective, I have to take the actors at their word that everybody's trying to do a kind of environmental good. And if that's the case, we do have these really sort of sticky paradoxes about what's going on, and then who gets to decide what that good is, where that good is applied, and sort of how those ethics are constituted. Excuse me. Because through that, we have a lot of, what we would call the slow violences of imagining a place and flattening it to its resources. If a place like Thacker Pass, like its only value becomes the mineral wealth that can be extracted, what do you have to do in your mind and through governance processes to that place rhetorically to justify that kind of extraction? And that redounds to who has the power to make those decisions, and then who and what gets to belong to the future that the energy transition is trying to create. And I will say on this last point here, I think one of the really important sources of potential that I see, especially with geoscience folks, quantitative and positivist researchers really trying to engage with these issues, is that, it is in the hands of the people who do the science that's legible to governments to really help bridge some of these epistemological ruptures that happen between, some of these more indigenous ways of knowing, these more situated, place-specific ways of knowing these places and this hydrosocial knowledge, and translating into ways that make sense to the government, or helping people figure out how to communicate quantitatively, or at least approximate that in ways that make sense to policymakers. Because I will say from my work that a lot of the folks that I talk to that aren't hydrologists, that aren't scientists, they don't have a lot of hope that their perspectives are ever going to be legible in ways that would feel sort of real and material for them in a lot of these policymaking processes. I wrestle a lot with thinking through what I'd call like the geoethics of working from a place of hope. For a lot of these communities that, trying to get people excited about sort of being hopeful, it feels hollow. So that would be the provocation I would make to the physical scientists who are here, is thinking about, if one has to concede that positivism is going to be the language of government, as at least it is in the United States. I know from reading lots of things in New Zealand, y'all do it a lot better than we do. I teach a paper in one of my classes on river personhood, and like that, it's incredible and aspirational, but to people in the United States, it feels like a fanciful pipe dream. So yeah, I think to save some time for discussion, that is what I have. If folks would like access to any of the papers or ideas that I'm talking about, I'm certainly happy to share reference lists, reading lists, anything like that. But yeah, thank you for listening. This is, it makes me feel good, and it makes, and I always tell the folks that I work with way out in the desert, sort of when I'm trying to tell their stories around the world, it matters to folks to feel heard. So thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Noel. I feel like there's so much to take in from what you shared with us. Both, I think, like what you've left me with at least is a real sense of challenge, and that idea of the geoethics of working from a place of hope, I think, is something that I'm going to have to sit with for a while. Yeah, so we do, yeah. Thank you so much again, and especially everyone. Noel is coming to us live from the United States, so it's quite late for him, and so big appreciation for that. We do have. Oh yeah, what's up?
I will also say, I'm finishing up my PhD and I'm on the job market.
Hi, Noel, everyone. Um, we've got probably 10 minutes for some questions and discussion. So anyone who has a question or a thought to share, just pop your hand up or jump in, or you can put something in the chat. Also, you guys welcome, you presenters welcome to ask questions of each other, of the audience. Yeah, go hard. Just maybe while people are thinking, I'll start us off with a question. I think yeah, when you were kind of wrapping up that kind of really tricky key question in your presentation, Noel, about how do you kind of reconcile these different actors and the different value systems of how people relate to water and land. I was kind of thinking about Glenn's proposition of like a discursive mode of doing extraction. And I was wondering, how do you have a kind of convivial and discursive environment around extraction when you are coming from such a plurality of epistemological places, and also such a power imbalance in those values and epistemologies?
Yeah, in some ways, that's like the core paradox of my work. Um, there's not, the idea of convivial extraction is, you know, it's like I really appreciate where that's going. I think that's a really important, very realist perspective to have on what the world needs and how things move forward. But in some of the people I talk to in my work, you know, for some of them, like any extraction in that particular place is akin to genocide. Um, you know, and the crazy thing, at least in Nevada, is that there are better places to mine lithium where the chemistry of the rocks is better, like materially sort of, instead of trying to get it from hectorite clay, we have a spodumene mine that they're trying to build, which is like the bog standard way to mine it. But sort of this particular place, in some ways, it's become, especially for our current government, it's become almost a political spectacle to really drive home that they can mine this, and that there's so much effort behind it. But I think, I don't have an answer for how to repair some of these ruptures. I mean, in my work, in some ways, I feel like the best thing I can do is to just keep talking about this to as many people as I can.
I just saw Keha raise his hand and then Catherine. Nice to see you, Keha.
Catherine, do you want to go first?
Oh, that's really nice of you. Kia ora koutou katoa. Just like greetings and acknowledgement to all of you and also to our international guests. It was wonderful to hear from you, Noel. Like for some of us, as a 45 years of activism against gold mining in my home, I would describe it as conviviality. What is the conviviality of domestic violence? If we're on a planet and we're going to domestically destroy it through extractivism, that is actually similar to me as trying to find the good in domestic violence. But given the fact that humans need resources, or as however we define them, I learned about that. I just wonder if you could talk about reuse. So, for example, in this country, we've had a company develop a process whereby they can extract gold out of e-waste, and we've got mountains of freaking e-waste that we could actually get gold, palladium, and silver out of. We could actually look at what the Chinese are doing around salt rather than lithium batteries. It feels to me like the critical minerals thing is like a fashion list at the moment, and it isn't rooted in genuine need. I'm sure we're going to find a battery that will run a car that doesn't require that kind of extractivism. So do you think that we should be focused more on conviviality around extractivism, or conviviality and dialogue around using less and making what we already have above ground usable for our purposes? Because we're clever as well as insanely stupid. So I'd just like your views on those.
I'll jump in there. Insanely stupid. You look around the world today, and yeah, you do wonder. Absolutely. I totally agree, and in fact, part of what the manifesto we talked about was looking at ways to reduce and recycle as fundamental to thinking about heading forward. You talk about necessary extraction. Does gold count in that score? Does the world need more gold?
No.
There's some pretty fundamental issues there, but try telling that to your billion-dollar, trillion-dollar mining sector. It's the sector itself has become self-justifying, and the criticality arguments is just yet another, like you say, it's a bit of a fad. It's something that certainly Shane Jones jumped onto and said, here's a reason why we need to have more mining, and then completely undermined the whole basis for any justification for it by throwing coal and gold into the argument as well. So there's absolutely that, and I think one of the problems that Bram and Rob had with convivial conservation was this idea that it was all going to be jolly and a nice convivial conversation. But what they were falling back on was not the kind of jolly aspect of conviviality, but much more a more sophisticated, nuanced conversation where power differentials were recognized, and the inequity in power was foregrounded as part of those conversations, and I think that's a large part of it. And it's also, you know, part of what Thomas and I were very clear on is that yes, we need resources, but we don't need them to be dug up everywhere. And I think Noel's case study is the way you described it at the end, Noel. I'd love to know why are they choosing to do it where they're doing it and not where you say they should be doing it. You know, accepting limits to where they should operate and how they should operate. We talked about the way in which they, you know, there should just be some places where mining companies should not be going. And they're, you know, for a whole bunch of natural environmental reasons, for social reasons, you know, there's a vast number of places that you could identify where mining should not be going. And at the same time, that's not the whole planet. You know, there are places where resources can be extracted with minimal disruption to communities and to environments. And Noel, tell us the ins and outs of what you were discussing.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't have, you know, I'm not privy to all the decision making that went into sort of how these various projects got funding. The Thacker Pass project at the core of my work. In lots of ways, it's just the first. It was the first one to secure money. It was the first one to really get off the ground. It's also the one that's been in the news the most. There are some really high-profile court cases, really about Indigenous consultation, some less high-profile court cases that have been less high-profile court cases about water use and water rights and infringement on groundwater rights from the mine. But the attractiveness of the Thacker Pass deposit in particular is because of the sort of the volcanic history of the region, is that the actual hectorite clay that they're mining to get the lithium is, you know, it's feet under the surface. So they don't even have to they don't have to dig and then build the mine. They get to just start digging right from the surface and start processing material. So at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is it's cheaper. That's the big, it was, you know, it's the money talks. It's, you know, the other project that's getting built right now is the Rhyolite Ridge project down in Esmeralda County, Nevada. And that's a traditional hard rock mine. Nevada is no stranger to that. Like, as a state, we're like the fourth largest gold producing district in the world. People here, you know, like most of my institution is built and paid for on mining dollars. But the speed at which they are purporting to get the lithium from Thacker Pass to market, the ease at which they're extracting it, you know, it let them move, you know, sort of they were able to sell the spectacle of them moving forward with the process faster well enough that they were the first one to get to investors, and then it's cascaded from there. But there's sort of the rationality of any of it only really starts to pencil out when you look at who's making money, why, and how. As far as the actual material recycling, there's a movement in the Nevada state government to create what's called the lithium loop. This idea that we're going, because we have big Tesla manufacturing facilities and Panasonic manufacturing facilities just outside Reno. They make tons of lithium batteries. But the idea is that they'll be able to mine the lithium, refine the lithium, make the battery, and then recycle the battery all within the state of Nevada, which is lovely for lots of these companies because we haven't updated our mining taxes since the 1870s, and we have extremely low corporate taxes. So again, it's, you know, they get a lot of work done by telling everybody, oh, Nevada's empty. It's just a big desert. Like, we'll just like make all the batteries there. It's fine. You know, we'll pay no, you know, it's like we'll pay very little business state taxes, and, you know, like the mining taxes, like I said, it's something like 2% gross proceeds, and they have to build, like, don't quote me on this, but it's like less than $1,000 one time of public infrastructure. So it's all about the money here. You know, I said earlier, you know, it's like when I'm doing my work, I have to try and take everybody at their word that everybody's trying to do this to save the environment. But it's hard to not be cynical. when you're really looking at it from the dollars and cents perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. Keha, I see your hand raised and I do want to get to you. I just thought that Augusta's comment here was quite relevant to this line of conversation, which was that it can kind of the question of whether that a conversation and a consultation can be meaningful when one side will always be driven by profit, whereas community has different drivers. Maybe we'll go with Keha's question, and then you can kind of loop around to that. It is 5 o'clock, and I appreciate it's getting late for you, Noel, but I'm really enjoying this discussion. So feel free to jump off the call if you have to go, but we might just keep going for another 5 or so minutes, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, cool. Keha, do you want to ask your question?
Kia ora, thanks, Frank. Tēnā koe, Noel. First of all, I just wanted to thank you for the time and effort that you've put into producing this body of work, and then also coming at it from the perspective that you've done, really trying to bridge this gap in value systems and a system that is not very accommodating to that. It's a tough thing. It's something that I've also been very aware of and struggle with. As a geologist, how do we navigate in a world where most of our employment looks like extraction and destruction? And so I really do appreciate the conundrum you're in and the work that you've done to look at that. And my question is really along those lines. And I suppose not just a question, but my perspective on it at the same time is, so I look at areas where organizations are looking at more cyclical economies, where the extraction is cycled back into a process where there's a byproduct from that that's not just sent to a landfill, and then the byproduct from that is produces something else like food, and then employment, and then something else. And I don't know too many examples of this, but off the top of my head, there's a geothermal company in around Taupo in New Zealand called Tuaropaki that has a circular economy system set up. They use the steam, produce the power, electricity, greenhouse effect as well. So they have fruit, and then the waste from that goes to fertilizer for their stockyards, and then the milk from that is dried using the steam as well. So it's not a perfect system. It's still extractive, but it still has more of a cyclical lens to it, something that returns, not just extracts from the land. And I think that's potentially one way that I look at dealing with this conundrum that we have. But I was curious to see what your take on it is, how you stay positive despite all of that.
There are sometimes I just let myself not stay positive, if I'm honest. This was a conversation I got into at the Royal Geographic Society meeting last month. A session on emotional geographies. We had a really long conversation about working from a place of post-hope. If you sort of like put hope for that things are going to be how you want them aside, okay, then what do you do? In some ways, it's sort of like letting go of the future you want can ground you to do the work you need to do right now. And for the circular economy stuff, like the system you were describing sounds really beautiful. That sounds aspirational. That is the kind of thing that I think should give people hope. Cynically looking at the mining industry and like the efforts to make what they call the lithium loop here in Reno, everybody's really, or here in Nevada, everybody's keen to really do it, but nobody is going to do it at the expense of their profit. It's not going to happen. I mean, all of the lithium, we do have one active lithium project. It's a brine evaporation project here in Nevada. It's been operating since the 70s. And for all of that stuff to get processed to then come back to Nevada and be made into a battery, it still has to go to China because it's cheaper. We don't have we don't have the capacity. So I think, it's a little bit like solar power versus coal, like once the solar, the price of solar now is so cheap that actually, I think it's at the end of this month, the state of California will get no more electricity from coal. but it wasn't out of the goodness of their heart. It's because solar is cheaper now.
Yeah.
So like that's, sort of to put my Mark Fisher hat on, sort of like the capitalist realism take to it is that, well, that circularity will come when that is the cost-effective way to do it. But at some point, when the last river is, and the last tree has fallen and the last river burns, only then will some of these folks realize that we can't, in fact, eat money.
Mm.
So
I'll just just follow that up, Noel. One of the themes that keeps on coming through is kind of an acceptance that it's big capital, it's mining corporations that are driving this, and clearly they are. But we also we need to start imagining different ways in which the sector itself can operate. And this is going back to the 1970s. If we talk about national mining companies, so a nationalization of mining in places like Papua New Guinea, there's two mines that have significant. One of them is 100% owned by Papua New Guinean interests, including landowners and the state. So here in New Zealand, we don't have the same sort of presence, but there is an iwi-owned iron sands operation on the west coast of the North Island. So different models of ownership and different ways of understanding the contribution. Maybe we do need global mining companies for the next few decades, but let's not just let them be rampant by themselves. What sorts of guardrails can we put up around that? Is nationalization of some of these sectors a different way of handling these sorts of processes? The evidence out of PNG, by the way, is it kind of works sometimes, but not all the time. And it's like I say, experimentation and offers different ways of thinking about how we might land in the future.
it's definitely it's worth trying everything in case something works. Better than doing nothing and wishing it to get better.
Yeah.
I think that might be a good place to end it on. I'm really sorry. There are a couple of questions in the chat that we haven't been able to get to, but I wonder if I saw Noel, you shared your email there. So I wonder if we can take these conversations elsewhere. I just don't want to keep people for too long. This has been so valuable. I feel like this is one of the most engaged audiences we've had for one of these seminars. And so I just want to thank you both again for your time and everyone involved for this corridor. And sorry, something in the chat. Can Noel tell us how to support the Saltbush Sea?
Yeah.
You have a last comment to make on that?
Yeah. Follow up with me by email. There are certainly films and things to share to get the word out about what's going on. I'm happy to share those links. I'm happy to share all the work that I'm working on, preprints, anything. Just, it's in our position as academics, like there's not, sometimes all we can do is document it and share it, get the story out, get the story around, and maybe somebody else in a different part of the world can benefit from what we're learning. In a tribal council meeting that I went to try and get formal permission to work with one of the tribes, they told us no, because they told us that we were too late. They're like, we're grieving, like we don't want to be involved. This already happened. So, but rather than be, sort of while we're recognizing that some of that ship might have sailed, we're still doing this work so that the next one won't. So get in touch. Happy to share everything. I promise I'm not always this much of a bummer.
You're not a bummer. You're inspiring. Hey, can I just put a plug in too, Frank? There are people here, academics, who have shown so much commitment. Professor Mike Joy and Glenn and others in this country, and there's work to be done. So please support those of us at the front line of this. Coromandel Watchdog of Hauraki, the people in Taranaki fighting for the seabed, and the people in the Otago area fighting against Santana minerals. So plenty to be done. Thank you.
Yes, there's always so much to be done. Thank you so much for coming along, Catherine, and for your work always. I just want to acknowledge before we close out that there's we've been through some quite heavy topics, and this has been quite, I think, I think it's been really productive and meaningful, but yeah, I just want to acknowledge that before we close out. And I'm going to close us with a karakia so that we can move on from this space and yeah, take these messages in our heart, but also kind of whakanoa, come back down. So yeah, it's just quite a simple karakia this time. Kia hu, kia marino, kia whakamoemiti, kia manatu, kia marohirohi, kia tuku, kia rite, kia tina, tina, haumie, huie, daiki. Thank you everyone for coming. Keep an eye out for our next seminar. We don't have a date yet, but we're going to talk about some things that really continue on themes that have been explored here about knowledge, justice, and reflexivity in the practice of earth science with Drs. Ritodi Chakraborty and Brendan Blue. So yeah, you should get an email if you got the email for this. And thank you everyone so much for coming and for such an animated and beautiful discussion. Ka kite.